Hello, and welcome to the Wisconsin Department of Transportation's Introduction to the State's Draft Rail Plan 2050. We'll get started in just a moment with an introductory video about the rail plan before we move to a question and answer period with WisDOT's rail plan experts later in the session. Welcome, and thank you for your interest as we initiate the public review period for the Draft Wisconsin Rail Plan 2050. I'm Matthew Sorensen from the Wisconsin Department of Transportation, Bureau of Planning and Economic Development, part of the Division of Transportation Investment Management. Over the next 20 minutes, I will share information about the status of the Draft Wisconsin Rail Plan 2050 and review a few key plan topics and the evaluation and analysis that was completed over the last 2 years. I will discuss the financial implications of the draft plan and explain the process for providing public feedback, whether that feedback is a question about the information provided in the draft plan or a comment to be considered for the final rail plan. I'll end the presentation with a short review of next steps and a description of how comments will be captured and compiled to inform the final stage of plan development. Before I describe the details of the draft plan, I would like to share a few logistical items with you regarding your participation and feedback. WisDOT encourages you to provide comments or questions, whether you're viewing this video in a live webinar session or watching a recording of a webinar that has already taken place. If you are participating online, please know the presenters cannot see or hear you. To share your questions or comments with the presenters, please use the comment form on the right-hand side of your screen to provide feedback. If you are using a mobile phone with video capabilities to view this video during a live webinar session, you will find the comment form on the bottom of your screen. The comment form will be available once the webinar has opened for questions and comments. If you are calling into a live webinar session without video capabilities, please send your comments or questions on the draft plan via email to dot.wi.2050@dot.wi.gov. The Wisconsin Rail Plan 2050 will replace Wisconsin Rail Plan 2030, which was adopted in 2014. By adopting this plan, Wisconsin will meet the federal requirements set forth in United States Code Title 49, Chapter 27, which requires that states adopt a rail transportation plan in order to remain eligible for certain types of rail-related federal assistance. The Wisconsin Rail Plan 2050 will help Wisconsin remain competitive for available federal rail funding now and in the future. Wisconsin's long-range multimodal transportation plan is called Connect 2050. Finalized and adopted in May 2022, Connect 2050 is a vision plan that identifies goals and objectives to guide development of an integrated, efficient, and safe multimodal transportation system in our state. The draft rail plan provides policies and actions for implementing rail-related goals and objectives identified in Connect 2050. Connect 2050 describes what we need to do to continue providing a safe and efficient transportation system in Wisconsin. The draft rail plan describes how Wisconsin will accomplish these goals and objectives as it relates to freight, commuter, and passenger rail. The draft rail plan provides an overview of rail activity in Wisconsin, including freight rail, commuter rail, and intercity passenger rail. The plan identifies rail priorities for WisDOT and includes an environmental evaluation, equity analysis, and rail-related safety considerations. The plan also includes a summary of financial planning and funding opportunities and an illustrative list of rail projects in the state. The Wisconsin Rail Plan 2050 will be shaped through 5 distinct planning phases. Phase 1, kickoff. Phase 2, the pre-draft plan. Phase 3, the draft plan. Phase 4, the final draft plan. And Phase 5, final plan adoption. The kickoff phase included publishing a notice of intent and drafting a public involvement plan. The pre-draft phase included initial outreach and consultation, including with Wisconsin's tribal governments, to help scope potential plan issues and opportunities. Currently, the plan is in the draft planning phase, which includes a 30-day public comment period, after which WisDOT staff will review and consider all public comments received and revise the draft plan where necessary. During the final draft plan phase, a 45-day public review period will open, and a public hearing will be held. Stay tuned to Rail Plan updates for further information about the public review period and public hearing. Finally, after the final draft plan phase, the Wisconsin Rail Plan 2050 will be formally adopted by WisDOT and submitted to the Federal Railroad Administration later this year. Wisconsin's rail system supports both statewide and regional economic activity. The draft plan summarizes existing freight rail infrastructure and the major commodities that utilize that infrastructure to move goods into, out of, and through our state. The draft plan also summarizes current challenges and major capital projects. The draft plan identifies the 4 national, 2 regional, and 5 short line freight rail companies that operate in our state, transporting freight over Wisconsin's 3,200 miles of privately and publicly owned railroad track and 600 miles of publicly owned rail corridors leased by these companies. WisDOT has a long-standing commitment to transit services as a key part of a healthy economy. The draft plan and its support of commuter rail remains part of that commitment. The plan summarizes existing commuter rail services in Wisconsin and defines roles and funding programs necessary to continue planning for future needs. In Wisconsin, commuter rail is located in Kenosha, in the southeastern corner of our state, on the Metra commuter rail system. The Kenosha station served 350 daily passengers in 2018, offering 5 trains daily, Monday through Friday, and from 3 to 7 trains per day on the weekends. Metra is governed by the Illinois Regional Transportation Authority, and although Wisconsin does not provide state funding for Metra, WisDOT and Metra staff coordinate closely on safety and other rail issues. Intercity passenger rail also supports economic activity in Wisconsin, both regionally and statewide. Wisconsin's intercity passenger rail systems include Amtrak's long-distance passenger route, the Empire Builder, which has 6 Wisconsin stops from Milwaukee to La Crosse, the state-sponsored regional passenger route, the Hiawatha, which has 3 Wisconsin stops, 2 in Milwaukee and 1 in Sturtevant, and the Twin Cities Milwaukee-Chicago service, which when complete will connect Chicago to Milwaukee, Portage, Toma, and La Crosse on its way to Minneapolis and St. Paul in Minnesota. Amtrak's Thruway bus service connects many major Wisconsin cities to Amtrak's Hiawatha and Empire Builder rail systems. Nearly 90% of Wisconsin residents live within 30 miles of a rail station or within 15 miles of an Amtrak Thruway bus stop. The draft rail plan includes 13 policies and 53 action items grouped into 8 categories. Policies identify what WisDOT plans to do, and action items describe how WisDOT plans to do it. Among the 8 categories, safety and security is first and foremost. Other categories include the impacts on freight rail of connected and autonomous truck freight, investments in programs for intercity passenger and commuter rail, and long-term viability of rail corridors and the branch and short line network. The draft plan outlines rail plan policies in Chapter 1 and Chapter 10. The draft plan provides a qualitative analysis of potential environmental impacts, including benefits and burdens, resulting from the operations, maintenance, and future development of our state's rail network in Chapter 8 of the plan. This analysis considered system-level impacts with a conceptual focus on a statewide scale. It is important to note that this analysis does not replace future project-level environmental reviews, which may be conducted for future federal or state-funded projects. Project-level environmental reviews are critically important and may include strategies to avoid, minimize, or compensate for potential environmental impacts of future rail development in the state. The draft plan provides an equity analysis, which assists WisDOT with identifying potential negative and positive impacts of railroads on equity groups identified under Executive Order 12898 and Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. The equity analysis also assists WisDOT to identify the needs of traditionally transportation underserved groups, such as individuals and families without access to a motor vehicle, those not able to or choose not to drive a motor vehicle, or who do not have reliable access to public transit. The plan's equity analysis will assist WisDOT in developing policies and actions that will help balance transportation needs with those of the environment, historic and cultural resources, and the needs of the people of Wisconsin. The draft plan also provides a system plan environmental evaluation as required under Trans 400.07 2B2 of the Wisconsin Administrative Code. This evaluation is required when proposals contained in a state transportation system plan, like the Wisconsin Rail Plan 2050, are considered major and significant. A system plan environmental evaluation, or C, is more conceptual, qualitative, and general than environmental reviews for individual projects. The draft plan contains two scenarios. The first, a base case, assumes the continuation of existing policies and actions. The second, an implementation scenario, assumes full implementation of the Wisconsin Rail Plan 2050 and includes all existing, revised, and new policies. The C requirement is satisfied by chapters 8, 9, and 11 of the draft plan. The draft plan summarizes Wisconsin's railroad safety and security. WisDOT, freight stakeholders, federal and state agencies, partner communities, and all Wisconsin residents share responsibility for the safety and security of our state's railway. Railway safety and security issues include collisions and derailments, shipment of hazardous materials, trespassing, emergency response, assessing vulnerability, and driver crossing practices at grade crossings. The draft plan safety considerations are located in Chapter 7. The safety of Wisconsin's railways, highways, waterways, and airways is WisDOT's highest priority. The draft plan addresses the amount of funding available from various sources and Wisconsin's ability to spend that funding in Chapter 13 of the plan. Federal funds that can be used on rail projects are generally administered through the Federal Railroad Administration, the Federal Highway Administration, and in limited cases, the Federal Transit Administration. Passenger rail improvements are often federally funded with discretionary grants, which are competitive and do not occur every year. State funding is allocated through Wisconsin's biennial budget process and with state bonding. Both state and federal funds are required to have budget approval and are appropriated to various transportation programs by the state legislature. There are a variety of federal and state programs that contribute to funding rail projects in Wisconsin. Federal programs include the Local and Regional Project Assistance Program, the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvements Program, the Federal State Partnership for State of Good Repair Grant Program, and the Infrastructure for Rebuilding America grants. State programs include the Freight Railroad Preservation Program, the Freight Rail Infrastructure Improvement Program, the Transportation Economic Assistance Program, and safety programs funded through the Office of the Commissioner of Railroads. Funding programs are located in Chapter 12 of the draft plan. The draft plan includes illustrative project listing tables, which identify capital projects that are funded or anticipated to be funded, as well as unfunded projects and studies. The plan's project list will be updated as needed to reflect program funding cycles, discretionary funding awards, and other funded or unfunded projects. The project listing tables are located in Chapter 14 of the draft plan. Public involvement activities have been, and will continue to be, conducted by WisDOT during all 5 phases of the Wisconsin Rail Plan 2050's planning process. Since 2020, WisDOT has consulted with the Southeastern Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission Environmental Justice Task Force, tribal governments, and environmental resource agencies. WisDOT has also coordinated with Wisconsin's metropolitan planning organizations, regional planning commissions, the WisDOT Freight Advisory Committee, and hosted a freight rail conference, which included discussions of the Wisconsin Rail Plan 2050. Upcoming public involvement opportunities can be viewed on the Rail Plan's website at wisconsindot.gov/railplan 2050. The public comment period for the Wisconsin Rail Plan 2050 is now open and will remain open until February 26, 2023. All comments submitted by the public during this time will be considered as the draft plan moves through the final phases of its development. If you would like to submit a comment or question to our Rail Plan experts during the live webinar, please join the podium by clicking the Join the Podium button on the right side of your screen. Then submit a comment or question into the chat box. Your question will be addressed by WisDOT's Rail Plan experts in the order submitted. If your question is not addressed during the live webinar, one of our team members will respond via email at a later time. On behalf of the Wisconsin Department of Transportation, I want to thank you for your interest and participation in the development of the Wisconsin State Rail Plan 2050. Now we'll begin our question and answer session, when you will have the opportunity to submit questions to WisDOT's Rail Plan experts. Joining us today are Alex Gromovat, WisDOT's Planning Section Chief, Lisa Stern, WisDOT's Railroads and Harbors Section Chief, and Rich Kezier, WisDOT's Freight Railroad Program Manager. If you are ready to provide a question to our Rail Plan experts, please join the podium by clicking the Join the Podium button on the right side of your screen. Then submit your question into the chat box. Your question will be addressed in the order submitted. Our first question is, how long are trains allowed to block a crossing in Wisconsin?
Hello, this is Lisa Stern. I can take this question. So train operations are regulated on a federal level by FRA and the STB. Well, the operations are by Federal Railroad Administration. And there aren't any actual limitations on how long a train can occupy any space on its own corridor. There's nothing, I know states and local municipalities have historically tried to pass laws limiting the blocked crossing times, which have not withstood legal review. But I would say, with that said, the FRA is currently collecting information on blocked crossings. And if you Google FRA blocked crossings, you can submit any any incidents of a crossing being blocked in Wisconsin, put the roadway, the time it's been blocked, and the FRA is collecting that data because sometimes what can be done in working with the state transportation agencies and the federal uh, transportation agencies is work finding infrastructure improvements that might allow for the flow of both the vehicles and trains without blocking um, uh, blocking the sorry, blocking vehicles trying to get through a community, especially for the first responders. So that would be my suggestion, is to submit those notifications to the FRA website. And that's the end of my answer.
Our next question is, will the Rhinelander to Goodman and Park Falls to Ashland lines be reopened?
This is Rich Kedzier, and I'll answer this question. Um, the Rhinelander to Goodman segment up in the North Woods has been out of service since roughly about 2007. Park Falls to Ashland has been closed since a washout due to a big storm in 2016. And at those times, those line segments were owned by Canadian National Railway, and Canadian National Railway sold them to, along with several hundred other miles of railroad in northern Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, to Watco in January of 2022. And Watco's has an operating railroad in the Northwoods called Fox Valley and Lake Superior Rail System. And I know that they are studying both of those line segments and looking for, freight business that would run on those lines. But Watco will have to determine if it's economically viable to reopen those based on projected business traffic. But I do know that they are studying both of them, and we'll have to wait for the results of their analysis. If anybody has a follow-up question related to that, I'd be happy to answer it. And that concludes my answer.
While we wait for additional questions from webinar participants, I want to remind attendees that if you are ready to provide a question to our rail plan experts, please join the podium by clicking the Join the Podium button on the right side of your screen. Then submit your question into the chat box. Your question will be addressed in the order submitted. Our next question is, are there opportunities to develop more rails to trails or rails with trails in Wisconsin?
Yes, this is Lisa Stern, and I can take that question. So, back in the 80s and 90s, there were significant amounts of rail corridors in the state of Wisconsin that were being abandoned. And at that time, there was a significant conversion to rails to trails. Since then, more recently, freight rail roads have been growing. Their operations have been expanding rather than contracting in across the country and including our state. So there's a lot less opportunities and a lot less, lines that are going to full abandonment at this point. So, although the state does continually review and look for potential lines to preserve those corridors through rails to trails, there's not a lot of that activity going on now, except for maybe some endpoints of some lower volume lines. As far as rails with trails, that is something that is generally, we try to avoid that type of combination. There might be a few very limited locations where we're trying to both get under a bridge together or some very, short distance, a couple 100 feet kind of times where we would look to put a rails with trails. But generally, we don't want to be mixing the recreational or personal transportation like a bike and pedestrians with the industrial operations of a freight train. That's generally not a safe combination, and it has to be done and to be done in a designed in a very specific way. That can be challenging. So we try to limit any rails with trails operations in the state, although they do exist in some limited cases. Yeah, as far as that goes, I guess that's all I have for the answer at this point. But again, willing to take any follow-up questions if there are any. Thank you.
Our next question is, how much active railroad in Wisconsin is publicly owned?
This is Rich Kedzier again, and I'll answer this question. The state of Wisconsin owns approximately 620 miles of railroad in the state, active freight railroad. Slightly under 600 miles is in the southern part of the state, the southern counties. And that mileage is operated by Wisconsin and Southern Railroad. And an additional 20 miles is operated by Wisconsin Great Northern Railroad in Washburn County. The state started acquiring railroad in 1979 in order to preserve that mileage for essential freight service. And the mileage has, of course, grown since then. And we deem the program to be highly successful. If anybody has any follow-up questions to this subject, I'd be happy to answer it. And that concludes my answer.
While we wait for additional questions from webinar participants, I want to remind attendees that if you are ready to provide a question to our rail plan experts, please join the podium by clicking the Join the Podium button on the right side of your screen, then submit your question into the chat box. Your question will be addressed in the order submitted. Our next question is, what is WisDOT's current policy on the establishment of quiet zones? Does the draft plan address this?
Yes, this is Lisa Stern, and I can take this question. So WisDOT we do actually have a policy, which is that we do not establish quiet zones. That is purely in the responsibility or authority as well as the local municipality or the local roadway authority. And the actual establishment of a quiet zone is regulated by the Federal Railroad Administration and their train horn rules. Where WisDOT does become involved, as well as the Office of Commissioner of Railroads, is we are required to be, if a local municipality would like to establish a quiet zone, you have to perform a diagnostic, which has to include the Wisconsin DOT, the Office of Commissioner of Railroads, the railroad itself, the local municipality stakeholders, which varies from community to community, and then the Federal Railroad Administration. So that's really our role in a quiet zone, is we go out there and help do the safety evaluation of the crossing and what would be required as far as what they call supplemental safety measures, which are the additional safety projects or upgrades that we can do at a crossing to compensate for the removal of the horn. That's really a sounding safety device to warn people and traffic that a train is coming. So, if you do have additional questions, the Federal Railroad Administration does have a website, and I would actually Google the train horn rule. It's kind of how it's put in online, and you can look into that. And otherwise, there are quite a few communities across the state that have already established quiet zones. So if you live in a community that already has one, you can reach out to your local municipality and look to help establish another one in your community, or maybe the neighboring town has one that you could reach out to them and find out the steps that they took as well. So that would be my recommendation as far as quiet zone. That's the end of my answer for that question.
Our next question is, based on a brief review of the state rail plan, it seems that expanding or providing more intercity passenger rail service to Green Bay from Milwaukee, or providing additional intercity passenger rail service between the Twin Cities via Eau Claire and connecting via Madison, seems to lack in-depth detail or scope in the state rail plan. Are there plans for WisDOT to reevaluate more detailed analysis for better long-range planning of expanded intercity passenger rail service for Green Bay, Madison, the Fox Cities, and Eau Claire?
This is Lisa Stern, and I can take this question as well. So I think that observation is accurate. At this point, we have not done in-depth evaluation. We've done some statewide analysis for passenger rail services, and the in-depth analysis that we have done has been really focused on existing passenger rail services, such as the Hiawatha and then the TCMC on the La Crosse line, which runs along the Empire Builder route. With that said, I think the opportunity to do a more in-depth studying and evaluation of these lines and what it would take to reestablish passenger rail to Green Bay, Madison, and Eau Claire, which are all included in our rail plan, both this updated 2050 version as well as the previous 2030 version, is the federal program, the new federal program called the Corridor ID program. Now, the department has received letters of interest from all of those communities, and including the Fox cities and Green Bay, Madison, Watertown, Pewaukee, as well as a, a coalition of communities in the Eau Claire area as well, asking that those lines be submitted into the corridor ID program. The department is currently evaluating those requests. If those lines were put in, I'll just add that if those were, selected and become part of the corridor ID program, that's when that in-depth detailed studying would happen. So those would be the first 2 steps really of that federal program would allow for that more in-depth evaluation and planning of those lines. And I'm happy to answer any follow-up questions, but that ends my answer to that question.
Our next question is, what is the expected timeline for resuming passenger rail from Green Bay to Milwaukee?
So this is Lisa Stern. Again, I can take this question. So there is not an actual set timeline for resuming passenger rail service. It is kind of looking out in our medium term goals. I think, at kind of following on to my answer for the previous question, if that corridor does get submitted and then accepted into the corridor ID program, that's where we would really look at what would the infrastructure improvements be required between Milwaukee and Green Bay to reestablish a passenger rail service along that corridor. Now, that's really going to make be hugely influential into when a service could actually start, because what level of infrastructure improvements are needed, how long is that going to take, kind of looking at the level of funding available, does the benefit cost make sense? All those questions would have to be answered. So, at this point, we don't really have an answer of when that would happen, but those are the steps that need to be taken to get to that answer. So that concludes my answer for that question. Thank you.
Our next question is, since the state rail plan was released late, are there plans to extend the comment period by an additional 30 days? Given the time period to review the state rail plan, the current review time seems very short and not a lot of time to adequately review.
This is Alex Gramavant, the Planning Section Chief. I can answer this. So to the first part of that question, plans of this nature generally take a couple of years to develop. So we are a little bit behind schedule, but we're trying to chug along as expeditiously as possible. So as far as extending the comment period, there's actually a second public comment period that's forthcoming. So for the major phases of work, we have the this is the draft plan phase where we release the plan for a 30-day public comment period. We will then review all of the comments that we receive, consider any plan updates, and then we're re-releasing the plan or releasing the final draft plan for an additional 45-day public comment period, which will include a public hearing to satisfy state requirement, state statute trans 400. So there will be a total of 75 days for public review. However, I would like to mention that our online comment form, I check it weekly regardless of whether there's a comment period ongoing or not. So just because a formal public comment period is closed does not mean that you can't still submit comments. That being said, once we're excuse me, close to plan adoption, it gets a little trickier, but I would encourage you to submit your comments even after the 30-day public comment period, or wait for the final draft plan to be released, which I'm expecting probably this spring, April, May, something like that timeframe, and then you'll have an additional 45 days. So I hope that adequately answers the question. If there's any follow-up, I'm happy to take that as well. Thank you.
While we wait for additional questions from webinar participants, I want to remind attendees that if you are ready to provide a question to our rail plan experts, please join the podium by clicking the Join the Podium button on the right side of your screen. Then submit your question into the chat box. Your question will be addressed in the order submitted. Our next question is, the model expects to attract passenger traffic from the Minneapolis-Milwaukee market. How will the plan evaluate how airline service competes on the same sector?
Yes, this is Lisa Stern. I can take this question. So one of the things that when we did the passenger rail forecast, it was really a statewide model. But one of the things it does look at as far as, competition with airlines is looking at the cost of a ticket versus the time it takes to fly, looking at Chicago to the Twin Cities market. So that is taken into that evaluation. I think, again, kind of, to go along with my previous responses is that once you start looking at specific corridors, you can, take that into account on a more specific level. One of the things I would just add as well for Wisconsin, specifically in the public in Wisconsin, that um, you know it's a little less direct because our a lot of the people getting on the Empire Builder route, the current route that runs from Chicago to the Twin Cities, are getting on within our state, on Columbus, Portage, the Dells, and Toma, and going either to the Twin Cities or Chicago, where for those folks, the airline idea isn't necessarily the most competitive. But I would just say that, you kind of go back to when you are looking at what is the expected ridership, you do kind of look at potentially taking some of those people who might fly out of Milwaukee, let's say, to the Twin Cities, and kind of in a competition. Although it would take a little bit longer, it will take longer on the train. It'll be cheaper. Kind of evaluating the people who are riding it just to the Twin Cities. The other thing that's looked at is how many people are making connecting flights, right? Because we're not going to be those folks that are getting out of Milwaukee, going to the Twin Cities or Chicago, and then flying somewhere else aren't likely to take the train first and then go to the airport. So all of that is taken into consideration, especially when you're looking at more corridor specific passenger rail or passenger ridership forecasts. So I don't know if that exactly answers your question. Feel free to, follow up with a follow up if you'd like, but that concludes my answer for now. Thank you.
Our next question is, when it comes to expanding future intercity passenger rail service in Wisconsin, operating subsidies will become an important issue. If the state legislature cannot agree to fund future operational expenses for operating future route expansions in Wisconsin, how will this impact WisDOT and how they budget or plan for future rail operations for new or existing intercity passenger rail routes in Wisconsin?
Yes, this is Lisa Stern. I can take this question as well. So, I think as we move forward with the plan and doing those evaluations for those corridors, one of the things we're going to have to look at is, does this make economic sense? What kind of operational costs would we expect? What can we recover from ridership and revenue? And it will be important as we expand beyond the Hiawatha and the current, the TCMC service that we're currently working on, to make sure we have the appropriate budget to actually to make that those happen. And if, as we get to these corridors and we identify, additional passenger rail routes that we'd like to expand passenger rail service, as what's shown in the plan. If we look at the route to Green Bay and we say, this makes sense. We've done the studies that we've talked about in a couple of some of the previous questions where we've looked at it. We've done an evaluation of the infrastructure needs that are going to be needed in order to start service, and it all makes sense on a benefit cost basis. That what you've mentioned there is going to be an important step. Is there budget financial support from the state to consider operating this route? There's going to have to be somebody that's willing to cover those costs. Now, what we've found, when we've done evaluations for the Hiawatha and other states, most specifically Missouri just recently completed an analysis, is that actually the tax generated revenue from the service more than offsets the costs to operate for those states. So those are things we would have to look at and work through with all of the people who are the decision makers on what the budgets are. But that's going to be an important step in the process, is for the department or the state to continue moving towards the goals that are outlined in the plan as far as passenger rail goes. And I'm happy to try to answer any follow-up questions, but that's what I have for now. Thank you.
Our next question is, how long does it take for a corridor to be approved or added to the national or state plan?
Okay, this is Lisa Stern again, and I think I understand what this question is, but technically these corridors are already part of the current plan, the 2030 plan, and they're in the draft 2050 plan, so they're already in the state plan. They are also already in the Midwest. The FRA did a Midwest plan, so they're already in the national plan, as well as Amtrak's plan. So they're already in all of the national and state plans that I think these lines that we've talked about should be in order to be evaluated to move forward. But as far as the next planning steps, so the Corridor ID program, the applications will be due at the end of March. The FRA will take a couple of months. They're expecting to kind of publish the corridors that were accepted into the program by the end of the summer, early fall of 2023. And then there'll be some time period to do the agreement with FRA. So, whatever state and or partners, state partners, there's, I think, some local commissions that are looking to submit as well. They would get that agreement with FRA and then probably start doing the planning process at the end of 23. But that would really start fully doing that study and planning process in 2024. So you would have that first step, what they call step one in the Corridor ID program. It's going to take a couple of months. I would say you're talking, depending on the corridor, it could really vary from 6 to 9 months, maybe even a year if it's a long corridor with a lot of, without a lot of information already available. So then you have the second step, which is the service development plan, which again, I would say will also vary depending on how long the corridor is, how much work may have already been done previously. You're identifying potential station locations. You're looking at what would the service look like. So that might take another 6 months to 9 months. And then once that's done, you have to identify the infrastructure improvements along those, and with those step one and step two. And so then the third step would be the environmental process. So you'd be going through the NEPA portion, and as anybody who's been part of a public project knows, that as well can really vary. So that the environmental clearance can really vary depending on what kind of level of infrastructure improvements are going to be needed. So, you know, we're talking a couple of years before, even if everything would start up right away and we'd move through it really quickly, the actual start of any service would be, you know, 4 to 5 years out from now.
There is a comment for the expert panel from Jay regarding a previous question regarding airline traffic. Jay says, there is a very complete data set available from the DOT regarding airline traffic. The information is presented on an O&D basis, which strips out any hub connecting traffic, along with average yield per fare. As I recall from my days at Midwest Express Marketing, the Milwaukee-St. Paul to Milwaukee was quite sizable, about 60,000 passengers annually. The addition of a meaningful stop just west of Milwaukee might actually pick up a decent amount of traffic due to service congestion of reaching Milwaukee Airport from that side of town.
This is Lisa. I'll just thank Jay for that comment, and we'll definitely look into that as we move forward for quarter evaluations. Thank you.
While we wait for additional questions from webinar participants, I just want to remind attendees that if you are ready to provide a question to our rail plan experts, please join the podium by clicking the Join the Podium button on the right side of your screen. Then submit your question into the chat box. Your question will be addressed in the order submitted. Our next question is, when it comes to long-range planning with transit, intercity bus transportation, and intercity passenger rail service, how much planning efforts are being developed by WisDOT and the state of Wisconsin to form partnerships that allow better connectivity between passenger rail, intercity bus service, and local bus transit agencies around the state of Wisconsin?
Yeah, this is Lisa. I can take an attempt to answer this question. So I think, historically there has been some interaction between transit, intercity bus, and intercity passenger rail. However, I would say that it definitely could be improved. And more recently, I work in the railroads and harbors section here at the Department of Transportation, and we have been reaching out and working with the transit section to better connect intercity bus and passenger rail, um, and making sure, our section actually, we have a contract with Amtrak that runs the throughway bus up to Green Bay, and that is specifically scheduled and timed to connect with the Hiawatha trains so people can get to Chicago. And one of the things we've looked at the success of that train is, or sorry, the success of that throughway bus is trying to work with the other bus systems in the state that our transit section is part of, and do a better job of seeing where we can improve those schedule connections, because although on a map you can see a lot of nice lines interconnecting, the timing doesn't always work out in a way that's good for the traveling public. So that is something we are working on within the department. It's not really outlined in the rail plan specifically because it's getting kind of into more of the weeds, but that is an effort that we are working on here internally. So that's the end of my answer to that question. Thank you.
While we wait for additional questions from webinar participants, I want to remind attendees that there are 15 minutes left in today's webinar session. If you are ready to provide a question to our rail plan experts, please join the podium by clicking the Join the Podium button on the right side of your screen. Then submit your question into the My apologies, there might have been some technical difficulties with the audio on my last statement. While we wait for additional questions from webinar participants, I want to remind attendees that there are approximately 12 minutes left in today's webinar session. If you are ready to provide a question to our rail plan experts, please join the podium by clicking the Join the Podium button on the right side of your screen. Then submit your question into the chat box. Your question will be addressed in the order submitted. Our next question is, when the 2050 State Rail Plan is finalized and accepted in the near future, how long will the 2050 State Rail Plan be in effect until another review period occurs? It has always been my understanding that many individual state rail plans are periodically reviewed every 5 years. Any timelines for periodic reviews of the state Wisconsin Rail Plan?
Sure, this is Alex. I can answer this. So you're absolutely correct that traditionally that about every 5 years is when a plan needs to be updated and revised. So in the statewide long range plan that was referenced earlier, Connect 2050, Appendix A actually includes a schedule for plan updates going forward. So we acknowledge at the time of this adoption, which was, I want to say, May 2022, we acknowledge of what all of our current statewide long range plans are, when they were adopted, an update frequency if required, in the next major action. So within this table, this somewhat solidified our commitment to looking at this plan and making sure that we take a look and have a current rail plan. So it is in the cards to try to ensure that our plans are updated every 5 years. In this plan, just a one note on that the bipartisan infrastructure law (IIJA) did change update frequency for some of the other planning documents, such as the state freight plan. That is not the case for the state rail plan. That requirement did not change. So we're still operating under the 5 year update frequency. And that's the end of my response. I'd be happy to take any follow up. Thank you.
While we wait for additional questions from webinar participants, I want to remind attendees that there are just 5 minutes remaining in today's webinar session. If you are ready to provide a question to our rail plan experts, please join the podium by clicking the Join the Podium button on the right side of your screen. Then submit your question into the chat box. Your question will be addressed in the order submitted. The time is 2:00 p.m. and we've reached the conclusion of today's webinar session. On behalf of the Wisconsin Department of Transportation, thank you for your questions and for joining WisDOT today to discuss the draft Wisconsin Rail Plan 2050. Have a great day.